Okay, so with push-up hand spacing, depending on where the hands are, yes, you can push more mechanical stress on different areas. So for instance, if I do closer together and elbows tucked, I'm gonna be hitting primarily tricep extension, right? So triceps. If I go wider, I'm gonna be hitting more on the shoulder joint, right? I think for me, I much prefer, you've heard my spiels before about, finding Shane's perfect squat, and anything that's not that squat is a modified squat, right? And we use certain assessments and testing things that we teach in program design. I think the same thing can be said about the push-up. You have to find, or any exercise for that matter, you have to find the hand spacing and the upper arm position that's right for you. For me, most people is going to be the typical like military push-up where the arms are about 45 degrees and then the hands are pretty much right under your shoulders. I feel like because you're kind of in that area of scaption, that's the safest place to be. That's probably your best position of power. Now for chest development, if somebody wants to develop more like chest size or whatever they're trying to do with a push-up, or even looking at that translating it into a bench, you'll hear a lot of people talk about going wide, and that's an old bodybuilder thing, right? If you want a wide chest, you can bench wide. But part of the problem is that as you start to abduct the humerus, you put yourself in a more and more position of impingement. So yeah, you'll hit a lot more of the front delt and you'll hit a lot more of the outside part of the pec, but the problem is you're putting yourself in a position where the humeral head wants to punch forward and that subacromial space starts to close off, and that will lead eventually to an impingement and jack up your shoulders, right? So you're always looking at where's an optimal place, where's a modified place, and we often talk about, like in terms of powerlifting, you've got two main things you're managing: your position of power, and then also your position of best biomechanical leverage. Meaning that if I squat like this, that's not a very good position of power. If I go here, that might be a better position of power. If I go here, I might still be able to maintain power, but now I don't have to move the bars far. If I go out here, I really don't have to move the bar far, but now I have no power. So you've got to leverage all those exercises of where I'm putting my hands and my feet depending on what you're looking for. So I think, you let me know if you agree with me or not, that standard push-up here is probably your best bet, right? In keeping the elbows at 45 degrees or even tucked a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's where, so you mentioned just before about shoulder impingement, is that if you have someone come to see you, and we see this a lot of the time, right? It's like office workers, coaches, anyone like that, or someone who's been training for a number of years and has now built a posture, those rounded shoulders. You've got your humerus naturally is sitting further forward in that joint. So your range of motion before you hit that impingement is shorter. And so before we get that, or if we don't get that joint centralized essentially, or brought back to some type of middle point, if we think about the joint being slightly set further back in the joint, is that they're going to have a greater range before they reach that impingement. So for someone like them, going into a wide position push-up may be more valid for that person because they're able to access that range. Whereas I know for me, for example, is like my range, especially through one side of my shoulders, is my joint just sits slightly further forward. So my risk of impingement is greater without even needing to go very wide. And so I think that's where we have to think, is that one thing you mentioned is that changing the exercise relative to the person, so individualizing the exercise. But we need a starting point, right? And so if that's, let's say, your military stance or military setup, that's always your foundational point for everyone. And then same way you would with a squat, then you go, okay, do we need to go hands slightly wider? Do we need to go hands slightly narrower? And knowing that we have that point of divergence from a starting point, but that way every client that comes in, they always have the same regimented style of going, where do we start you? And then where do we take you to? Whether it's narrower, further out, whatever it may be.
I think one good assessment to look at someone, if you can just look at them from the side, and if you see that their humerus sits a little bit forward, they're not going to be a great candidate to go very wide. If it's sitting forward, it's already there. Once I start to go down, I'm already putting stress on the front of the capsule. So if the joint is sitting back, then I've got more leeway of going that far. And I think that's one thing we've talked about a lot about, movement of the scapula and the T-spine, but that's another thing that people don't think about, is it's not just about T-spine and scapula, it's also about where is the head of the humerus sitting and where is it rotated as well, and also what's that in relationship to the clavicle. Okay, and can their upper arm be stabilized? If it's not being stabilized, like let's say there's a supraspinatus issue, and if it's not sitting stable in there and it can't move properly, it's just going to ram into the acromion and cause an impingement, which is something we see a lot here at our facility when people come in, because of what we talked about in another push-up video, those half push-ups and doing push-ups too wide and doing things not working up through the levels of different types of push-ups, or bench press as well. If that's all pushed forward and I go on a wide grip bench with my elbows flared, all I'm doing is putting excessive amounts of force or tension in an area that doesn't have the range of motion to actually get there.
Can you just go back into that position, just because one thing I just want to point out is that this is going to be, for some people, this is going to be glaringly obvious in terms of how joints move, but for some people, how joints move, especially through a shoulder joint, can be a little bit confusing when we think about the elbow. So go into your push-up position in that position. The elbow going back, naturally the top of the humerus is going to slide forward slightly in terms of a rotation, because even though it may seem obvious for some of us, is that with our joints, is that the ball and socket joint is that the joint doesn't sit on a rod in terms of the joint rotates and doesn't move forward or back. So the actual head of the humerus is that as that elbow's going back, the head of the humerus is coming forward. So if we're already, as you can see here, is that especially because of how developed Luke's shoulders are, you can see the anterior part of the deltoid is already actually quite, like, even though it's under stretch in this position, it's quite well developed in the sense of like it's pushing forward. So if we think about a client who doesn't have that type of development with their shoulders, they come in and they're rounded in this position and you try and put them into a press up, because that joint's not actually fixed and just rotating, it is actually sliding as well. So in terms of like, it's got 360 degrees of range of motion, essentially in the sense of being in a full circle. It can go up, down, forward and back. So as that humerus is coming back, the joint itself is not similarly going back to match that. The joint itself, if it's not staying centralized, is drifting forward. And that's where you'll find, whether it's a bench press or whether it's a push-up, the client goes to do it and they go, ooh, and they feel this pinching pain here. You can't just necessarily give them more reps or change the positioning and suddenly fix that. They also need to work on why is that joint sitting further forward and jammed in a position, whether that's tightness through the front or whether that's weakness through the back or a combination thereof. We need to address why is that joint running out of space so quickly. And so that's something to think of, is like, that's just what I want to point out, is that I know that's going to be obvious for some of you, but for some trainers starting out in the industry, as we think about joints and we don't yet really understand, if we move one joint or one point of a joint further away, the other end of that joint has to essentially move. So it either has to move forward, back, up or down, or a combination of. So it's just something to bear in mind, is when your clients are moving, think about what else is moving as to why that might be causing pain, if it is.
And we also have to understand, if you don't have enough space in the joints, that the joint can't move anyways, because once you run out of room, it's bone slapping on bone. So that's a lot of the cases where you see a slight decrease in subacromial space, and that people end up getting impingements or bursitis, or they might end up with a small infraspinatus tear or something like that. And in a lot of cases, this stuff can be referred pain into the neck. You know, if you're doing a lot of work here and you find that the next day the muscles in your neck are really tight, okay, that might be a case to start looking at the upper lower traps and start looking at the other musculature there, because your migraines and your forward head posture could be related to where your humeral head is. You know, so it's a lot of cases it's a matrix issue that you need somebody to really diagnose and go through properly with you to make sure that you hit those ranges of motion, if that exercise is proper for you.
On that, just before we wrap up, is I think that is
a 2-minute push-up, hand push-up video.
This is a 2-minute video, depending on where in the world you are. 2 minutes here in Australia, it's a long time. Waffle. One thing to think about as well is you addressing everything. I had this with a client previously in person, is that you're addressing everything for those push-ups, trying to get their scapula in position. They return straight back to their posture through the day and they just sit back into this posture. Their body's built to be in this posture because that's what they're reinforcing every day. We've covered this in other videos, but think about what are they doing in terms of throughout the day. You're not just going to keep correcting it in the gym. They need to do some work by themselves away from the gym to start encouraging these positions to come back into some sense of normality.
It's always the little everyday things that are going to have the biggest impact on your success, because it doesn't matter how hard you train it in the gym, if that's only an hour of your day you've got another 23 hours in a day where you're screwing it up by doing simple everyday tasks, and that's not gonna be good, right? So the last thing I'll talk about to wrap this up is one assessment I like to do is look at them from the side. You should be able to drop a plumb line from their ear to the shoulder, to the hip, to the knee, to the ankle, okay? If that shoulder is moved forward, what I'll tell them to do is try to go into shoulder flexion, and what you'll find is the further that is, they can't actually achieve shoulder flexion. So then I'll tell them to pull that arm back as hard as they can, or pull the scapula back and then go in the shoulder flexion. All of a sudden they can achieve shoulder flexion. They go, holy shit. Now they've come to an understanding that their imperfect posture currently is going to limit some of the things they can do. And it's a very simple test that we can get them to understand that concept.
I like that.
Yeah. And that's the hardest thing too, is getting them to do the rinky-dink exercises like power raise, lower trap raise, all that stuff that people don't associate a proper back workout to, that they need to be doing for months to correct these issues before they think about rowing and pull-ups and things like that.
So that was a 2-minute video on the push-up.